In 1898, after a family dinner, many members of the family all went to go sit on the front porch while one of the children ran down to grab mail from the post office. When he got back, he brought with him a package. When the package was opened, they found a note along with a small child's handkerchief. The note said, "With love to yourself and baby," and it was signed Mrs. C. After the package was completely opened, it was found to contain a box of chocolates in this pink box that had the word bonbons on the top. Several people that were sitting on the porch had at least one piece of candy. Later that day, some members of the family started to get sick. And as the hours went on, some began to get better, while others got far worse. By the next day, at least one family member had died. And just a few hours later, another family member also passed away. The only thing that they had in common was eating the chocolate. But who would have sent it? And why? Welcome to the Beach House 34 True Crime and Paranormal Podcast. I'm your host, Christine Worth, and this is the story of Cordelia Botkin. On Friday, August 12th, 1898, in Dover, Delaware, 35-year-old Ida Dean passed away. Ida was the wife of J.D. Dean and the daughter of a well-known senator named John Pennington. Now, earlier in the week, on Tuesday, the family of John Pennington, which included his daughters, Ida and Mary Elizabeth Dunning, along with Ida's husband and all of the children, along with other friends, all had dinner together, which consisted of corn fritters and trout. Now, after dinner, many of the family members went out to sit on the porch while one of the grandchildren, Harry, was sent to the post office to pick up the mail. He returned with a package that ended up being a box of chocolates. And inside this package was a child's handkerchief and a note that read, "For yourself and baby, with best regards, Mrs. C." Since there was no name on the package, they did try to read the postmark, but it was illegible. Now, Mary Elizabeth Dunning, though, believed that it was sent from a friend of hers who lived in San Francisco. She and her husband, they had lived there for a time, and she became friends with a woman who had the last name of Craven. So that would make sense. The candy appeared to be homemade. The box it came in was pink, and on the top of this pink box was printed the words bonbons. Now, inside the box were several different kinds of chocolates. Some were cream based chocolates, some were caramels, and some were little chocolate buttons. Now, some of the candy even appeared a little smushed. Mary Elizabeth opened up this box and gave it to those who were sitting on the porch. Now, since most of the family, including the children, were on the porch, nearly everyone took a piece of this candy. A few of the people who took one of these pieces even made the comments on how good it was and that it seemed to be a very high quality. One of their visitors, though, Josephine, she didn't think so. She had been given a piece of the candy, but she didn't like it. She had been offered a second piece, but she already had plans to visit another friend, Mrs. Walter, across the street, so she turned it down. And as she was walking to her house, she had a bad taste in her mouth left over from the candy. She took out her handkerchief and wiped away what appeared to be white powder. Now, Ida seemed to be the one who enjoyed the chocolate the most, and she ate more pieces than the others did. So everything was fine until later that night. Ida had woken up first, and Ida did not feel very well. She had to run to get sick several times throughout the night. And because of this, she was given what were called household remedies at the time to help her through the night. Now, back in the late 1800s, this could have been anything from ginger to baking soda to apple cider vinegar, whatever they had. The family felt that whatever was bothering her would just simply be gone by morning. Now, Ida, though, was not the only one who began to have issues. Her sister, Mary Elizabeth, also started to get sick with similar symptoms. As morning came, Ida's daughter also began to get sick, just like the others. So did Harry, the young boy who had ran to the post office and gotten this package. And not only did they all get sick, two other women also ended up getting sick. Now, they did not have dinner with the family, but they had come to stay the night. So, at first it was thought to maybe have been the trout, the fish. But there were only a handful of those who got sick. And these women that were visiting, they never had dinner with the family. So it couldn't have been that. Now, Ida and Mary Elizabeth, along with Ida's daughter, still felt bad the next day. But again, they just thought whatever this was, it just had not yet passed. Ida's daughter did start to get better, but Ida and her sister Mary Elizabeth were still very sick. It wasn't until 12 hours had gone by of them feeling this badly that a doctor was finally called, and he came out to the house to check on them. Now, everyone just believed that those who were sick were suffering from cholera morbus. Now, if you're like me, you have no idea what that meant. Well, essentially, it's an old term used to describe gastrointestinal illness. And the reason the word cholera is in here, it's that at the time, it just simply resembled cholera symptoms. So around noon on Wednesday, Ida seemed to get far, far worse. At 4:30 on Wednesday afternoon, Ida passed away. Now, Ida's sister, Mary Elizabeth, she also was not recovering. Her condition, like Ida's, continued to get worse. And because of this, the doctor stayed at the house to keep a close eye on her. Now, you might wonder, why was she not taken to the hospital? Well, it was 1898, and yes, hospitals did exist, but they were often used for the very poor, and the upper class of society preferred to be treated at home by private doctors. Now, this doctor was very concerned that Mary Elizabeth, just like her sister Ida, also might not make it. Now, Mary Elizabeth's husband, who was not there for the dinner, he actually happened to be an Associated Press correspondent. And at the time, he was in Puerto Rico. So by this time, two doctors were now at the house, and they both had a little bit of hope that Mary Elizabeth, 44, would recover. She appeared to be doing a little bit better, but then later on in the night, she took a turn for the worse. And then she too passed away. Now, Harry, the grandson who had gone to the post office to get the package, he had also eaten some of the candy and he wasn't doing great, but the doctors felt that he would make a full recovery, which he did. Now, after Mary Elizabeth had passed, they had to somehow get word to her husband. Now, given that it was 1898, the fastest method of getting in touch with him would have been the telegraph. And this meant that he could be notified either just within hours or even within at least the same day. An analysis was going to be done on the chocolate, and autopsies were also going to be performed on Ida and Mary Elizabeth. If you find that you enjoy these true crime and paranormal stories brought to you by Beach House 34 and you find yourself keep coming back time and time again, make sure that you don't miss an episode by subscribing through your favorite podcast platform or even on YouTube. Subscribing not only helps support the show, but keeps you in the loop with the latest podcast and video content. I am so grateful for your support. Thank you so much. Now, back to our story. The actual investigation of this candy and what happened to Ida and Mary Elizabeth actually didn't even begin until the day of their funerals. And even then, The only reason it was started was at the request of their father, John Pennington, who happened to be a former congressman. Now, he believes that the mystery of how and why they died will eventually be solved. And he seemed to hint to a newspaper at the time that he had some information about it, but he couldn't talk about it just yet. He had a suspicion of where the candy came from and may even know who sent it. Now, back then, when it came to investigating suspicious deaths, it was actually the coroner who would begin the investigation. And the coroner would then summon a jury. And these would be men in the community. And their job was to consider all of the information that they had so far to try and get to the bottom of the case. Now, generally, this jury would hear this information from the coroner, and likely they'd also hear from other witnesses. The jury would then reach a quote unquote verdict about the possible cause of death. Now, the doctor who was at the house did testify in front of this jury and told him that the deaths of Ida and Mary Elizabeth were due to poison from candy that they had received. So, one piece of this candy was sent off to a group of chemists at the Pennsylvania Railroad Company located in Altoona, Pennsylvania. Now, this was known to be one of the best labs in the world. Another piece was looked at by a chemist who happened to be employed by the Associated Press, the same company that employed Mary Elizabeth's husband. A third piece was then sent by Ida and Mary Elizabeth's father, John, to a place in Newark, New Jersey. So while all of these tests are going on, local authorities start their investigation. They know that the candy was sent by a woman and that her purpose in sending it was to specifically kill Mary Elizabeth. Their belief in this was that the writing on the inside and the outside of the box of candy appeared to be that of a woman. Now, Mary Elizabeth herself, she had said that she believed that this chocolate had come from a friend of hers in San Francisco, even though she couldn't quite read that postmark herself. Now, the government at the time would have been able to trace where this package came from. Investigators said that the writing on the outside of the box that the chocolate came in seemed, quote, natural, while the note inside seemed unnatural, as if someone were trying to disguise their handwriting. So, at this point, no one has any idea what kind of poison was used on this candy, but it is guessed to have been arsenic based just simply on how the victims reacted after they ate some of this. Now, Mary Elizabeth's husband, the one who works for the Associated Press, is known as Jack Dunning. He was not able to make it in time for the funerals. He was still in Puerto Rico and he had to get on a ship in order to get home. Now, Mary Elizabeth, she was actually living with her father, and which is why she was at this house. And she had been living with him for about 2 years because her husband's work with the Associated Press had kept him away for that long. They did have plans, though, that when Jack returned, they were then going to move to New York. So by August 16th, it was confirmed that both Ida and Mary Elizabeth had, in fact, been poisoned with arsenic. One of the doctors who examined the chocolate found pieces as large as peas inside the candy. So, to put this in perspective, a single pea would be about 230 milligrams. The lethal dose of arsenic runs between 70 and 200 milligrams. So, whoever sent the family this box of chocolates had every intention of making sure that people died from it. As soon as the doctor realized what was in the candy and how much, he came to Dover, Delaware, and then presented these findings in front of the coroner's jury. When he arrived, the coroner and the jury, they had already been asked to come in and hear what he had to say. And of course, that also made the rounds of Dover. And since many people wanted to hear what he had to say, a very large crowd also showed up. This doctor, his name was Dr. Wolf, he testified that he received 3 pieces of the candy. And after he had started his testing, he realized that the candy contained this very large quantity of this poison. He said, quote, the sender of the package had not even taken the precaution to pulverize the poison, but left it in lumps. According to the doctor, there was enough poison in just the 3 pieces of candy that he had to kill 4 people. Now, remember, the jury's job was to determine if the deaths of the women were in fact on purpose. And after hearing what Dr. Wolf had to say, they all agreed, obviously, that yes, this was done on purpose. After they had made this determination, their portion of their job was done. It was now up to others to determine exactly where this candy had come from. They do know that the candy was sent first class and that it had been taken to the post office to be weighed because of the number of stamps on the outside of the package. Now, after the package was examined further, it was learned that yes, it had been sent from San Francisco. And while they couldn't read a lot of this postmark, they did see the word Fran at the beginning and an O at the end of it after they looked at it through a magnifying glass. So, meanwhile, in San Francisco, word had gotten out that someone there had sent poisoned candy. The San Francisco Examiner even ran a story, and I cannot believe this. They ran a story about the wife of a W.A. Botkin, who it was suspected sent this candy. But here's the thing. Back in this late 1800s, oftentimes it was rumors that pointed the way towards a suspect. The article, though, said, in essence, that the wife of this W.A. Botkin, her name was Cordelia, and she also went by Ada. She was 42 years old. She had been known to be having an affair with Mary Elizabeth's husband, Jack. Now, Cordelia and her husband, they had been actually separated for 2 years, but they had not divorced. When a newspaper reporter found out where Cordelia actually lived, she went to go ask her a few questions. But then Cordelia said, hey, I want to talk to my husband first and get some advice from him before I answer any of your questions. So what she did then was go with the reporter to where her husband was. And after speaking with her husband in private, then turned around and told the reporter that yes, she would speak to her. So Cornelia answered the reporter's questions, and her husband was right there as she was answering all these questions. And when it was all said and done, the husband said that the story that she gave to the reporter was 3/4 fiction. Cornelia started out saying she couldn't believe how unfortunate the situation was, and then she gave the following statement.
Why, I never knew of such an unfortunate, and if I had not befriended him, if my influence had not been exerted on his behalf, he would most certainly have committed. At times his poverty was painfully abject, and he even suffered for the common necessaries of life. I myself have supplied him with the food that sustained life. In fact, I prepared him all the food he ate, having learned his favorite dishes and how to please him. Poor Jack. Poor dear little fellow. Why, he had to drink to drown his feelings. He would have lost his mind if he hadn't. And now, when he hears of his wife's demise, of her having been poisoned, what will become of him? And worse yet, when he learns that a woman who associated with him in San Francisco is suspected of the crime, he will immediately think of me. He will know I am that woman, and I tremble for the effect it will have upon him. He will kill himself, he will blow out his brains. Poor little Jack, how I pity and sympathize with him. Dear little fellow. Oh, the irony of fate. Think what it would be if I should meet Jack Dunning in a courtroom. Of course, he would never believe me guilty, but what do you think? Tell me. Do you believe that if he learned I am suspected, he might never want to see me again? Don't you think he may possibly come to the conclusion that he will never again want to associate with anyone who has been mentioned in connection with this horrible tragedy? What if he should?
She also went on and on about how Mr. Dunning, or Jack, had a reckless lifestyle of heavy drinking. And she went on about this so much that the reporter asked if she would even want to be associated with someone like that.
Why, that thought never occurred to me. I could assert that in a courtroom, couldn't I? But then again, what if later on I should marry him? What if we should yet come together? Would suspicion then be directed to me more strongly? Might not the strong arm of the law then be laid upon me, even after a lapse of time?
Now remember, she is saying this in front of her husband, her estranged husband, but still her husband.
Jack used to jestingly say to me, when referring to his failure in life and his dissipated habits, that I wouldn't marry him even if he were free, because of them. But you see, my influence over him is so strong that I could do much with him always. Mr. Dunning told me that he sent his family east to reduce the expenses of their living. In no way did he speak of illness in his wife's family. He told me that his wife did not want to go east, and he had to use all the diplomacy at his command to get her to acquiesce, which she finally did in order that he might retrieve his losses and get on his feet again. He said when she had gone that it would be a long time before she gets back again.
In other words, Cornelia painted Jack Dunning as someone who was very unlucky. And if it wasn't for her, he would have tried to unalive himself. She called him so poor that he rarely had food to eat. So she cooked for him and that he drank away his depression. Now, after learning about his wife being poisoned, she was worried that he wouldn't be able to cope. And that once he realized a woman from San Francisco had sent the chocolates, he would think of her right away. Again, she feels that this realization would again send him to the brink of unaliving himself. She also believes that he would never believe that she was involved, but if she were named a suspect, would he even want to see her again? And then she mentions that in the event they got married, would it then put more suspicion on her? So it's very apparent by her comments to this reporter that she's painting a picture of a guy who is down on his luck and she did nothing but make his life better, mainly because she was in it. Now, Jack Dunning, he was asked if he knew Cordelia, and he admitted that he did, and that most of the statements that she made were true. Now, remember, though, Cordelia's husband, though, thought that a majority of it was made up. So Jack Dunning was then asked, how did he meet Cornelia? And this is what he had to say.
I got off to make some slight repairs to my bicycle in Golden Gate Park one day and noticed two women seated on the bench nearby. I made some casual remark and finally introduced myself. One of these women was Mrs. Botkin. From that date, I called to see her frequently and finally took lodgings in the boarding house where she lived. I met social friends of Mrs. Botkin there and played cards a great many times in the evening with other lodgers. Mrs. Botkin and I finally began to go to the races at Ingleside. Of course, we made bets there, and at times, like everyone else who indulges in racetrack play, we met with losses.
Now, this place that Jack talks about, this boarding house, would be similar to a bed and breakfast today, but more for a long-term stay and with a lot more structured schedules. So Cornelia, in her conversations with the reporter, also made sure to mention another woman's name. Now, this woman was a Mrs. Clara Abergast. And when she found out that Cornelia had mentioned her in regards to this poisoning, she was, to put it bluntly, very pissed off. I mean, who wouldn't be, right? She said that just the fact that someone she didn't even know would accuse her of this proves that she is a terrible person. However, we do find out that Mrs. Abergast actually did know someone from Cornelia's family. It wasn't Cornelia, it was Cornelia's husband. She had met him about 2 years ago when she stayed at a hotel where he was also staying. She made very sure that the reporter knew, however, that the way that he acted towards her was no different than how he was acting around the other women.
Mr. Botkin was simply a friend, an acquaintance. He is a good friend to our family, a particular friend, calling on me when he comes to San Francisco, just as any gentleman would upon a lady. I have gone out with him alone, to the theater and elsewhere, but beyond friendship, there is nothing. It is not true that I have tried to induce Mr. Botkin to divorce his wife. I know nothing about this terrible affair of the poisoned candy, and can throw no light upon it. I do not know Mrs. Botkin, would not recognize her were I to see her. Neither am I acquainted with Mr. Dunning.
So we find out that Cornelia is having an affair with Mary Elizabeth's husband. When the suspicion of sending the poison to Jack's wife comes up, she gives another name, a woman who was friends with her husband. So it seems to me that Cornelia is just trying to exact her own personal revenge since this woman didn't even know of Jack or Mary Elizabeth. If that wasn't all, another name was brought up, a woman by the name of Mrs. Louise Seeley of Chicago. Now, this woman was a friend of Cornelia's who knew about the affair and evidently at one time had come all the way to Stockton, where Cornelia lived at the time, to tell Cornelia's husband about this affair. So, yeah, lots of moving parts here. It was discovered that Jack Dunning, Mary Elizabeth's husband, he did, in fact, of course, have this affair with Cornelia while he was in San Francisco. But we learn that not only did he have an affair with Cornelia, but he was having three different affairs. First, there was Cornelia, obviously. It appeared that this relationship was closer than the others. Jack admits to writing Cornelia essentially love letters even after leaving San Francisco. Now, at the same time, Jack is also turning around and writing these same kinds of letters to his wife. So, next we find out that there was Mrs. Louise Seeley. Even though she denied it, and Jack did too at first, he eventually admitted that, yes, he had an affair with her as well. Now, the third woman, whose name has not yet been brought up, but we find out the third woman was someone by the name of Madame Thompson, and she taught French, and she was often at this boarding house participating in these card parties. So, after all of this came to light, Cornelia then went to a hotel by herself and refused to talk to reporters any longer because she knew that she wouldn't be quoted correctly. More likely though, she wasn't aware that Jack was also seeing other women as well as her, which probably really upset her. So, in the meantime, Cornelia's estranged husband still said he doubted that she actually had an affair with Jack. So then what happens is an order comes through the Associated Press telegram that said the attorney general is almost satisfied as to who is responsible for the murders of Ida and Mary Elizabeth, and that they intend to arrest the woman soon. No, so Mary Elizabeth's husband, so Jack, he finally comes back to Dover, Delaware, and absolutely refuses to be interviewed. And no matter how many times he was asked questions, he responded with, I have nothing to say. Now, remember, he worked for the Associated Press, and he was often gone for very long periods of time, which gave him plenty of opportunity to have his affairs. A newspaper at the time wrote that even though people have learned about all this, he was, quote, never a more dutiful and loving husband, saying that he wrote to his wife every day and told her how sorry he was that he had to be away from her and their child for as long as he did. He told his wife nearly everything in the letters that he had done on that day. Well, everything but the affairs. He also, obviously, never told his wife that he's sitting there writing these same kinds of letters to Cornelia. And he actually called Cornelia Ada. And so he would address these letters as Dear Ada or My Dear Ada, and then sign them with Love J. So now Jack, he's back in Dover, and all of this information is coming out about his affairs, and that one of these women likely sent the chocolates to his wife with the full intention of killing her. Not only did his affairs lead to his wife dying, but also her sister. And remember, these were his father in law's only two daughters. So not only is his father in law beyond angry with him, so is his brother in law, Ida's husband, because without these affairs, she too, Ida too, would also still be alive. So Jack is then forced to give a public statement through a newspaper. And here's what Jack had to say.
I know Mrs. Botkin very intimately, but I will not say now whether she was acquainted with my wife. She did know, however, that I was a married man, and it was with this knowledge at her party that many letters passed between us from the time I said goodbye to her in San Francisco and came east to go to the seat of war. I do not doubt but that she still has many of those letters in her possession.
And just then, the reporter pulled out a copy of a letter that Cornelia had received from him. Very, very sneaky. The letter was dated in June, and this was just months before the candy had arrived. And here's what the letter said.
My dear Ada, please excuse the typewriter, but I have one handy and will use it to let you know that up to date I am all right. When you receive this, I wish you would address a line to me and let me know if you are all right. I can't tell you just what will be my plans. Don't feel any alarm about me at all. I will come out of this all right. With my love.
After Jack looked at it, he hesitated, and then he finally said,
Yes, I did write that to Mrs. Botkin. It is all right.
then, then he was shown another letter. I can just see this guy's blood draining from his face, probably wondering how many of these letters did this guy have? This one was dated March 16th, and this is what this one said.
Dear Ada, I have been too much rushed in the last few days to send you even a line. I am now on my way by train from New York to Key West, and I will take a steamer at the latter place for Cuba. I am going to try with all my power to live down the past with all its sorrows, and if anything arises in Cuba to give me a chance to do something, I believe that my future is assured. God grant that everything is well with you. I want to hear from you as soon as possible. J.
Jack then slowly admits that, yes, he also did send this letter and says that obviously the letters exist, so to deny them would be useless. He then continued talking about how he and Cordelia had met. I know that he had said some of this before, but this time he gives a few more details.
Our first meeting was entirely the result of an accident. It was a year and a half or 2 years ago that I was riding my bicycle in Golden Gate Park, San Francisco, when my wheel broke down near a beach where 2 women were sitting. One of these was Mrs. Botkin. While I was making the necessary repairs to my bicycle, I got into a conversation with them and went so far as to sit down and talk with them after the wheel had been mended. We simply introduced ourselves without the slightest thought of formality, and as there was no objection on Mrs. Botkin's part, the acquaintance that had begun there continued. I next met her at the racetrack at Ingleside, and thereafter, our meetings were frequent. Mrs. Botkin invited me to a card party in her rooms, and I went. Before I left that evening, it was suggested that it would be pleasant if I could live in the same house, and I was told that there was an available apartment. I secured it immediately and went to live there. After that, I saw Mrs. Botkin many evenings, for there were frequent card parties, to which she invited me and other friends. I cannot say how many evenings I spent with her or how frequently I saw her, but when I left San Francisco, I began to correspond with her, and I have kept it up ever since.
Well, at least he's coming clean. While he's telling this story, he is outside the home where his wife, Mary Elizabeth, had just died. Now, because this note had been labeled as being from Mrs. C, there were 2 options. Mary Elizabeth had a friend who lived in San Francisco, and she had mentioned this before. Her friend's last name was Corbally, but she was never under suspicion because, and this is what was mentioned, because she was close friends with her, and she could have never been included in this list of those who hated or were jealous of Mary Elizabeth. Now, this assumes a lot, I know. But evidently, they did go ahead and look into her anyway. But it was discovered that at the time that this candy was sent, Mrs. Corbally, her friend, actually was in the state of Maine. Now, one of the other women Jack was involved with was Madame Thompson. Remember, the French teacher who was often at those card parties that he attended. And yes, he talked about her as well, saying that he met her at these card parties and at a racetrack. She evidently did a lot of things with Cornelia, but Jack refused to mention who he thought may have been the one to send this candy. So on August 22nd, Cornelia, she has evidently been moving from hotel to try and hide where she is. It was learned that she was, quote, deeply distressed over the tragedy and agitated almost beyond self control by the publication of a dispatch that she is to be arrested on a warrant from Dover charging her with murder. And of course, who wouldn't be upset by this, right? Now, eventually, Cornelia does make a statement, which said, for the most part, I'm innocent. I am not the one who committed this crime. However, it was learned that at one time, an anonymous letter had somehow been received by Jack's wife, Mary Elizabeth. And in this letter, according to Cornelia, it said that Jack was devoting all of his time to another woman. So Mary Elizabeth then sent this letter to her husband, Jack, and Jack then sent it on to Cornelia, but this time he had added a little note, and this note said, quote, "You have a deadly enemy." Now, Cornelia denies that the two of them had any kind of intimate relationship and that these quote unquote anonymous letters were not sent by her. They were sent by somebody else. And she said she just must have an enemy out there somewhere, but she can't figure out who it is. Cornelia then says Jack went into sort of a massive depression when his wife and daughter, quote unquote, left him to go east. However, he was actually the one who requested that they do so to save on money. Cornelia also made it out to seem like, Jack was all but destitute because he used all of his money to pay for his life insurance premiums in the event that something were to happen to him. Cornelia said that Jack told her, quote, "It would be far better for them if I were dead." According to Cornelia, Jack did write to his wife and told her what was going on and then threatened to unalive himself, and that a woman named Mrs. Corbally became friends with him and helped him out financially. So remember, Mrs. Corbally is in fact a friend of Mary Elizabeth's who lives in San Francisco. So Cornelia is already trying to shift blame and conveniently shifting blame to Mary Elizabeth's actual friend in San Francisco, Mrs. Corbally. And honestly, I don't know if this was a thing at the time, but Cornelia said that her and her husband, remember, they weren't divorced. They had been married over 26 years, and he was actually still providing for her. They lived apart because of quote unquote different temperaments, according to Cornelia, but there was never talk of a divorce. Now, eventually, authorities did make their way to Delaware and they sat down. They had a long talk with Jack. They also went into his home and brought out what appeared to be the box that the chocolates had come in, as well as what looked like several letters. So, not long after this, authorities take a look at these letters that Jack had received from Cornelia and compared the handwriting with the note in the candy box, and they felt that it was a match. So, on August 24th, Cornelia was arrested at the hotel where she was staying. She asked if she could just stay at the hotel instead of jail, but yeah, no, that was not going to happen. However, they did allow her to go into another room and change her clothes, as well as pack a suitcase because she had to get on a train to head to Dover. Now, a doctor who evidently had treated Cornelia well before her arrest had ended up giving her some medication because she seemed to be quote unquote hysterical. Don't know what exactly that meant, but she was hysterical. And so he gave her medicine to help her cope with this. Well, this medication happened to be 32 doses of morphine, morphine. And he was afraid that she still had this medicine with her when she was packing up. And he thought that if she brought this with her, that she was just going to use it to unalive herself. So evidently it was not found while she's in jail. Of course, the investigation continues. Mary Elizabeth's and Ida's father, after learning about these anonymous letters, he starts to monitor the mail. And he did end up getting yet a third letter at the home where Mary Elizabeth had lived. So when an expert compared the handwriting on the letters to the one on the note with the candy, he also said, "Hey, this is the same one." Jack also said, Jack said that the letters are in the same handwriting as Cornelia's. Now, these letters that were written by Cornelia were actually done in the hopes of making Jack leave his wife or his wife leave him. So, as the investigation went on, it was also learned that Cornelia had received a letter from Jack saying that he was going to head back to his wife at the end of the time that he had with the Associated Press. And then once he got back there, they were all going to pack up and move then to New York. So I'm sure this probably just sent her on an upheaval, right? It was also learned that Cornelia had purchased arsenic at an Owl drugstore. Now, at the time in 1898, the drugstores had to keep a detailed record of sales for all toxic items. And they did find an entry where it was written wrong, but it says Mrs. Boffin of California purchased 2 ounces of arsenic on June 1st, 1898. And her reason, they had to write down the reason for her using it was to bleach the gray in her hair. In late October of 1898, Cornelia was officially indicted for the murder, and she's going to be held without bond. When she appears before the judge, of course, she pleads not guilty. When the trial started, one of the witnesses happened to be this clerk at the Owl drugstore who dramatically in court identified Cornelia as the one who had purchased this arsenic. Then Jack Dunning was put on the stand, and one of the questions he was asked was if he had ever told Cornelia anything about his wife. And what he said is that among the things that he did tell her was that she liked candy. At the end of December in 1898, Cordelia Botkin was found guilty of the murders of Ida and Mary Elizabeth. When the verdict was read, it was reported in the newspaper that Cordelia didn't cry and she didn't even have any kind of reaction at all. Now, after the verdict was read, and this is totally something you would not see today unless you wanted to get disbarred as an attorney, Cornelia's attorney said, quote, "Why, this juryman owes a large amount of money to members of the police force, but I will not say any more, and I have advised my client to keep a discreet silence." So in other words, Cornelia's attorney, after finding out that, she was found guilty, is suggesting that a certain member of the jury has a conflict of interest because somehow he owes money to the police, suggesting that maybe he's doing the police a favor by voting guilty. So Cornelia, didn't matter. Cornelia was sentenced to life in prison. A few years later, literally just a handful of years later, in 1904, she was actually retried, but convicted yet again. And what I found so interesting is that she was actually sent to serve her life sentence in San Quentin. Now, at the time, it was pretty rare for a woman to be there. The men and women, obviously, they were segregated. That's not so strange. But at the time in San Quentin, it actually, I think, had been built in 1852. It'd been around for a little while, but even then, they had probably the most basic of facilities and little, if any, healthcare whatsoever. And of course, at the time, women had very few rights, and it's very likely that she would have been abused by the guards. And even if she was, and even if she said, complained about it, rarely did any of the guards ever see any kind of punishment, even if they did do something. Also, while in prison at the time, she would have had to perform labor. Now, for a female, it could have been laundry or sewing or something along those lines. Nonetheless, Cornelia in 1910 passed away at the age of 56. But aside from this really small snippet in the newspaper, nothing more was there. And that, my friends, is the story of the Murder by Mail and Cordelia Botkin, and how essentially she became totally enraged that this guy that she was having an affair with, whom she knew was married, would not leave his wife. So she felt that the best thing to do was just try and off his wife, and then Jack would come back to her, which obviously never worked. Thank you so much for your support. If you want to hear more true crime and paranormal stories, remember to subscribe through your favorite podcast platforms or on YouTube. So until next time, keep your eyes open, and whatever you do, don't eat any candy sent to you anonymously. We will talk soon.